The raven came in the middle of the night. Tywin Lannister read the letter in silence, the fire crackling behind him. Even at this hour he was fully dressed, not a single crease on his crimson robes. His cold eyes scanned the parchment slowly, methodically, and when he was done, he handed it to Maester Pycelle without saying a word. Pycelle took the message with shaking hands. The seal had been broken already. Dragon wings curled around a silver crown. Daenerys Stormborn had landed. She was in Westeros, Dragonstone. She had dragons. She had Unsullied. She had Dothraki. And worst of all, she had Tyrion. Tywin didn't speak. He merely sat, fingers steepled, thinking. It was the kind of silence that made men sweat. Even Pycelle, who had served under kings and survived purges, fidgeted like a child in his presence. Finally, Tywin stood. "Wait, Kevin," he said flatly. "Send a raven to the Reach. Highgarden must prepare for siege. Olenna will protest, but remind her, who held back Robert Baratheon when the walls of King's Landing shook. Tell her to guard her granaries like they were her grandchildren." Pycelle nodded quickly, bowing as he scurried out of the room. The Lannister lord moved to the window, looking out over the dark city. King's Landing slept in ignorance, but he could already feel the tremble in the ground. War was coming again. He wasn't surprised. He had known for years that the girl would come, eventually. The moment he heard of Khal Drogo's death, he knew she would not die quietly in the east. And now, with the north in open rebellion, the south divided, and the Iron Islands stirring, she had chosen her time well. Cersei, of course, would have handled this with fire and madness, but Cersei was no longer in power. Not since Tywin returned from Casterly Rock last winter to reassert control over the capital and his children. Tommen was king, soft and easily molded, and that was exactly how Tywin preferred it. The realm needed peace, order, not wildfire and ambition. He had watched as the Mad King died for his madness. He would not watch his daughter repeat the same history. By morning, he was already in the small council chamber. Varys returned to his side the moment he heard of the Queen's Landing. The spider, always so eager to survive, had aligned himself once again with the man who understood power best. "They say she has 3 dragons," Varys whispered, eyes darting. "Full grown, large enough to burn ships whole. I've heard tales from Korth and Meereen that chill the blood. Men turn to ash with a single breath." Tywin barely blinked. "Tales are for fools and children. Dragons can be killed, and so can queens." He turned to his generals, Sir Adam Marbrand, Randyll Tarly, and Kevan Lannister. "She has unsullied. That means precision. She'll move fast, strike hard, and disappear. Dothraki ride like no Westerosi army can match. We will not meet them in open fields. We will trap them in terrain they don't understand." "And the dragons?" Kevan asked. Tywin met his brother's gaze coldly. "We bleed her army. We starve her forces. And when she grows desperate enough to use the dragons, we will be ready." Randyll Tarly, hard and grim-faced, leaned forward. "You have something in mind?" Tywin gave a slow nod. "There's a reason the Targaryens ruled with dragons, but never flew them into every battle. They are fearsome, but they are not invincible." He let that hang. "Every creature has a weakness, even fire breathers. If we can draw them out, isolate one, we may not need to slay it. We need only to show Westeros that it can be done." He turned then for the first time to Varys. "Tyrion is her hand." Varys gave a slow, almost regretful nod. "Yes, he is advising her, and he is cleverer than she knows." Tywin's face didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not
Rage, not sadness, calculation. Then we must show my son what happens when you betray House Lannister.
That afternoon, a raven flew to River Run, to the twins, and even to Dawn. Each letter held promises, or threats. Tywin wasn't looking to form a pact of loyalty. He was assembling a trap. Because if the Dragon Queen thought Westeros would bow to her just because she had fire, she had clearly forgotten who still ruled the realm, and Tywin Lannister was not in the habit of losing wars. The sea was calm that morning, a deceptive peace that stretched across the waters surrounding Dragonstone. Daenerys stood atop the cliffs, the wind catching her silver hair, her dragons circling far above in wide, lazy arcs. Drogon screeched into the clouds, and even here, hardened, unsullied, flinched at the sound. She had returned. Westeros was before her, trembling. But the Red Keep still stood, and her enemies were not fools. Tyrion approached quietly from behind, robes flapping as the wind teased at his short frame. "You'll forgive me, Your Grace, but I think the silence is misleading. They know you're here." Tyrion pointed at the map, tapping the southern roads. "These should be clear, we control them, but our supply trains are being hit before they even reach the heartlands. Someone's bleeding us, quietly, smartly." Daenerys frowned. "A coward's
War. No, Tyrion said grimly. Tywin's war. Jorah leaned forward. Then we strike back, burn the fields he controls, cut off his support. But Tyrion shook his head.
He has the lords of the Westerlands, remnants of the Reach, and now he's working on the Vale. He doesn't need to feed an army like ours. He needs only to wait until ours begins starving. Daenerys clenched her fists. "Then I take the dragons and end this. One push, one strike. We burn the Lannister army before winter can starve us." Grey Worm stepped forward. "Your Grace, it is not fear that will keep this realm. It is power. If they will not respect your justice, they must learn to obey your fire." But Tyrion was already pacing. "He wants that. He wants you to use your dragons. Because the moment you do, you lose the lords who haven't chosen a side yet. He's gambling that you'll lose control, become your father." Daenerys turned to him sharply. "And what would you have me do? Starve while he feeds rats and ghosts? I won't be bled to death by a man who hides behind quills and couriers." Tyrion said nothing. He only looked at her, his face haunted by memories he had spent years trying to bury. The way his father used silence like a sword. The way he always stayed 3 steps ahead. Even in death, he had believed himself untouchable. And now, somehow, he still was. Far to the north of Highgarden, in a quiet, burned village near the banks of the Manda, a column of Lannister men stood among smouldering ruins. No banners,
No colours, only armour darkened by ash and faces hidden behind visors. At their centre stood Randall Tarly, grim and ruthless, his sword still wet with blood. "You gave them grain," he said to the kneeling villagers. "What few were left alive."
"You harbored the invaders. The punishment is not death." He stepped over the corpses. "It's silence." Behind him, his men began driving iron stakes into the dirt, hanging the bodies upside down, letting them rot under the sun with notes pinned to their chests. This is what happens to traitors. In King's Landing, Tywin read the reports as if they were sermons. A cup of watered wine in one hand, his finger slowly tracing over each line. Tarly was doing his work well. The Reach was turning, not publicly, not yet. But the whispers had begun. He knew how fragile loyalty was when lords had to choose between surviving winter or burning for a foreign queen. He handed the parchment to Qyburn, who took it with cold fingers. "She will come," Tywin said. "She's cornered. She'll use her dragons." Qyburn smiled slightly. "And when she does, the scorpions will be ready." "Not just scorpions," Tywin replied. "Something more, something final." He turned his attention to a box that had arrived from Old Town. Inside, wrapped in cloth and glinting with cruel intent, was a bolt laced with obsidian tips and a concoction Qyburn only called the Bleeding Flame. "She burns cities?" Tywin asked calmly. Qyburn nodded. "Then we burn gods." Meanwhile, Daenerys stood on the balcony of Highgarden under a red dusk, Drogon's wings casting massive shadows across the valley below. She didn't speak. Not yet, but her eyes were no longer filled with vision. They were filled with fire. This war was about to turn, and Tywin Lannister, alive and watching, was waiting for her to make the one mistake that would undo everything. The dawn broke with no birdsong. Only the quiet hum of preparation, the creak of leather straps being tightened, the low clink of swords being sharpened, the distant roar of dragons waking from restless sleep. Highgarden, for all its beauty, had become a fortress. Not by design, but by necessity. Daenerys stood in the war room, no longer patient. "The time for warnings is over," she said, her voice low, dangerous. "Tywin Lannister poisons this land with his whispers and his spies. He cuts off my limbs while smiling from his throne. We end it. Today." Tyrion had argued, until his throat went dry the night before. He had begged her to wait, to bait Tywin further, to expose more of his plans before making her move. But Daenerys wasn't listening anymore, not to reason, not to history. And Tyrion, for the first time, saw something in her eyes he had seen once before, in her father's. Still he stood by her side. "Where will you strike?" he asked, though he already knew. She pointed at the map with a trembling finger. "Lannisport, the heart of the Westerlands, their pride, their trade, their
hope. I will take it from them in one day." It was bold. It was theatrical. It was exactly what Tywin would expect, and yet
It was the only move she had left that screamed power. Within the hour, Daenerys flew. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion soared like gods reborn, their wings blotting out the sun. Below them, the Dothraki screamed through the plains. The Unsullied marched in silent, lethal ranks. Grey Worm rode beside them, his face unreadable, but his hand never far from his blade. As the dragons passed over the reach, terrified peasants fell to their knees in prayer. Lords who once toasted to Targaryen fire now barred their gates in fear. She reached Lannisport by mid-morning and burned it by noon. The first pass was fire, unrelenting, absolute. Ships turned to floating pyres, barracks, marketplaces, even the outer ramparts melted in Drogon's wake. Screams echoed from the stone walls, and soldiers barely had time to aim before the second dragon came. Rhaegal tore through the harbour, turning waves to steam. Viserion landed atop the garrison tower, his fire pouring down into its very bones. The bells rang, not in surrender, but in panic. She didn't land, she didn't negotiate, she punished. It wasn't war, it was wrath. From the hills beyond the city, a small Lannister scouting party watched the destruction in stunned silence. At their center, A single figure mounted his horse, his golden armor dulled by age, but still unmistakable. Tywin Lannister. He watched without a word, his jaw set, his eyes calm. "She's fallen into it," he murmured. Kevin beside him looked unsure. "But the port is gone. The city means nothing," Tywin interrupted coldly. "Lannisport is not the war. The realm is." He held up a sealed letter. A copy had already been sent to every major house from the Vale to the Stormlands. In it were the names of every innocent man, woman, and child killed by dragonfire. A list that ended with one line: "This is your queen." Back in King's Landing, Qyburn prepared the scorpions, dozens of them, some mounted on rooftops, others hidden in alleyways. The Red Keep's walls had been reinforced with metal plates and obsidian-tipped weapons. Tywin had even brought in Meisters from Old Town to develop fireproof oil to protect the keep from being reduced to ash. But that was the obvious defense. The true weapon, the one Tywin hadn't even shown the council yet, was buried beneath the city. A crate from Volantis, locked, guarded by men who hadn't spoken since they were children. Qyburn called it the Breathless. He said it could do what Wildfire only dreamed of, and Tywin planned to use it, but only when Daenerys stepped foot in the capital. Because now she had to come. Lannisport had been bait. Not just to draw her wrath, but to expose her to the realm. She had given the lords what Tywin never could: fear. Not of war, but of annihilation. He didn't have to convince them she was mad. She had done that herself. Back in the charred remains of Lannisport, Daenerys stood atop Drogon's back as the fires still burned below her. She didn't smile, not like before. There was no joy in this. Only fire. Only death. She wanted Tywin Lannister to feel the cost of every whisper, every blockade, every lie. But even in the smoke, she knew. She hadn't broken him. She had played right into his hands. And now the whole realm was
watching.
Ash still clung to her skin. Daenerys sat in what was once the merchant guild hall of Lannisport, now gutted and scorched. The walls were blackened, the air thick with smoke and the faint, acrid stench of charred flesh. Outside, the city still, smouldered. And inside, her council stood silent. No one had the courage to speak first, not even Tyrion. She had won. But why did it feel like she had already lost? She looked around the room, her voice low but sharp. "Speak!" Grey Worm stepped forward. "The city is ours. The remaining garrison surrendered. No resistance remains. Casualties high." "How high?" Tyrion asked. Grey Worm hesitated. 3,000. Maybe more. Tyrion's face dropped. Missandei closed her eyes. Jorah turned away, and Daenerys just nodded. "They made their choice," she muttered, as if to convince herself. "They chose a man who hides behind silence."
This is his price. But the truth was darker. She hadn't seen Tywin. Not even a whisper of him.
No generals, no banners, no reinforcements. Lannisport had been empty. It was never meant to be defended. Tyrion finally stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "You need to see this." He handed her a scroll. A fresh raven's message. It wasn't addressed to her, but it was written about her. Word for word. It was already being copied across Westeros. "Today, Daenerys Stormborn burned 3,000 of my people, fishermen, bakers, mothers, holding children. She does not want peace. She does not want justice. She wants fire. Tywin.
Lannister, protector of the realm. Daenerys read it twice, her fingers tightening. He dares call himself that?
Tyrion exhaled, his voice heavy. He doesn't need to call himself anything. The lords are listening. Tarly is already reinforcing Horn Hill. The Tullys refuse to answer our ravens. The Eyrie is silent, and even Dorne is stalling. He didn't need to say it outright. They were losing the realm. At the Rock, Tywin stood before the hearth in his old solar. The fire was tame, precise, everything Daenerys wasn't. Kevan stood at his shoulder while Qyburn read aloud the names of Westerosi houses who had reaffirmed their neutrality. House Hightower, House Tarly, House Redwine, House Grafton, all cautious, but leaning. "And leaning is all I need," Tywin said quietly. He walked slowly to the war table where a map of Westeros lay spread, now littered with black lion tokens instead of gold. "We won't face her on open fields. We don't need to. Her dragons feed on terror, but terror burns out. And when it does, all that remains is ash." He tapped King's Landing. "She will come here. It's her prize." Kevan frowned. "You're certain? She burned a city that wasn't even ours. She will not rest until she takes the one that is." Qyburn stepped forward. "The weapon is ready, hidden deep beneath the Sept's ruins. When she flies, we unleash it." "What of the cost?" Kevan asked. Tywin looked at him for a long moment. "Would you rather she reign?" Silence. Tywin nodded. "Then we bleed, quietly, for the realm." In Dragonstone, Varys watched the horizon alone, robes fluttering in the sea wind, a raven in his hand. He hadn't sent it yet, but he knew what it would say. Tyrion has lost her. She no longer listens. She burns. The whispers across the realm had grown louder with each passing day. Daenerys, once a beacon of hope, was now a shadow of her father in the eyes of many. She may not have gone mad, but she was no longer unquestioned, and Tywin, cold, ruthless, methodical, was offering something different. Not warmth, not mercy, but stability. Varys didn't trust him. He hated him in truth. But even Varys knew one bitter fact. The realm was beginning to miss the cold hand of Tywin Lannister. Back in Lannisport, Daenerys stood atop a ruined tower, Drogon perched behind her like a god of death. Her eyes were red, not from tears, but from the smoke that never cleared. Jorah joined her, silent for a long moment. Finally, he asked, "What do you want, Daenerys?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "To be seen, to be heard, to be more than just the daughter of a madman." Jorah nodded carefully. "Then don't become him." But below them, her army had already begun preparations to march east, to King's Landing. The trap was set, and she was walking into it. The march to King's Landing was slow, not by distance, but by weight. Every step of Daenerys's army carried the burden of a victory that had turned into a question. Villages they passed no longer cheered, windows closed, doors bolted. The Reach, once a land of green, now felt grey and cautious. Every town held rumours, every face held doubt. They whispered of fire, of screams, of a queen who did not ask for allegiance, but demanded it in ash. Daenerys didn't speak of it, not to Tyrion, not to Grey Worm, not to Jorah. She rode at the front of the column, her face carved from stone, her dragons circling high above like silent omens. She hadn't flown since Lannisport, not out of mercy, but calculation. She knew the next fire would need to mean something. It would have to be final, behind her, Tyrion rode in a cart, hunched over letters he hadn't sent, ravens he hadn't loosed. He knew they were losing hearts, but worse, he feared they were losing themselves. Grey Worm remained unshaken, his unsullied flawless in discipline. But even he had begun carrying out orders with mechanical indifference. Jorah was quieter now, his usual counsel replaced with lingering glances of concern that Daenerys never acknowledged. And Missandei, sweet, loyal Missandei, had started to look afraid when Daenerys spoke of justice, the kind of justice that burned. Ati, the Red Keep, the capital prepared not for peace, but for siege. The outer gates were fortified, the harbour sealed. Black scorpions gleamed atop the battlements like monstrous insects. Behind the walls, every able-bodied man had been conscripted and rations stored. Tywin oversaw it all himself. He stood on the city walls, hands clasped behind it, his back as Qyburn walked beside him, listing final preparations. "She'll reach us in 5 days, maybe less. The dragons won't wait, they'll strike first." Tywin nodded. "Let them." "And when she lands?" Qyburn asked, voice quiet. Tywin looked out across the city. The people below bustled in controlled panic. Some prayed. Others sharpened blades. But they all looked to the keep, to him. "She will land," he said, "because she must prove she is queen."
And when she does... He didn't finish the sentence, but deep beneath the Red Keep, in catacombs untouched since the Mad King's time, a crate sat in a circle of salt and iron. Inside, the Breathless waited. Not a weapon in the traditional sense, no.
Blade, no powder, no fire, it was a toxin, brought from the shadows of Volantis, once used to silence entire cities during the old empire's collapse. Colourless, odourless, it spread through air and blood, and it left no survivors. Qyburn had perfected it, and Tywin, knowing what it could do, planned to use it not to save King's Landing, but to sacrifice it. Tyrion met Daenerys that night by a dying campfire outside their tents. He had waited for hours to speak alone when Grey Worm and the others were asleep or on watch. She sat by herself, feeding logs into the flames that never seemed warm enough. He crouched beside her, voice low. "You're going to burn the city, aren't you?" She didn't respond, so he pressed. "Even if they surrender? Even if the bells ring?" Daenerys looked up slowly. "Did the bells stop the flames in Lannisport?" He flinched. "They should have." She leaned in, her voice bitter. "You think I want to do this? You think I enjoy being feared? I wanted to be loved. I wanted to be chosen. But Tywin made sure I wouldn't be. He paints me as my father's daughter while his soldiers slit throats in my name and call it honor." "And what will you become?" Tyrion whispered. "To defeat him." She stood. "I will become queen." That same night, ravens arrived at the gates of Winterfell, the Eyrie, and Dawn. Each carried a sealed message. "Daenerys Targaryen has burned cities. She will burn the capital next. The choice is not between lion and dragon. It is between ash and order." Each letter ended with Tywin's seal, and each one had a final postscript. "When I fall, so will she. But when she falls, you will still have a realm." On the 4th day, Daenerys reached the hill overlooking King's Landing. The sight was both familiar and strange. Smoke from the chimneys, soldiers lining the walls, scorpions gleaming like iron fangs. The people watched from rooftops and windows. Holding their breath, Tyrion stood beside her, his voice nearly a whisper. "If you do this, there's no coming back." Daenerys's eyes were locked on the Red Keep. "I never planned to come back." And behind her, Drogon let out a slow, guttural growl. The sky darkened, the trap was set, and the storm was about to fall. The skies over King's Landing darkened, not from clouds but from wings. 3 shadows circled above the city, massive and slow, casting a silence across the capital more powerful than any bell or scream. The people below didn't run, they didn't hide. They watched. Daenerys sat atop Drogon, his scales glinting black in the morning sun, her silver hair whipped by the wind, her eyes locked on the Red Keep. Behind her, Rhaegal and Viserion wheeled in formation, waiting for a command. Below, the unsullied lined the outer perimeter of the city, flanked by Dothraki riders hungry for blood. Tyrion stood at the edge of the hill, heart hammering against his ribs. He had pleaded with her the night before. Again. "If the bells ring, promise me you won't burn the city." She never gave an answer, and now it was too late to ask. Inside the city, Tywin Lannister stood in the war chamber of the Red Keep. He didn't look to the sky. He listened. Qyburn entered quietly. "The Breathless is in place. We only need your
word." Tywin didn't speak for a long moment. Then he turned, not to Qyburn, but to the map of Westeros laid out before him. "I have ruled this realm from the shadows. I have killed kings, I have made monsters bow. But today," he looked up, gaze cold, "I bury the last dragon." It began with the bells. A slow, wavering peal that echoed across the rooftops of King's Landing like a final prayer.
one bell, then another, until all the towers joined in, the city surrendering. Doors swung open, flags were dropped, soldiers laid down their arms. Daenerys heard it, everyone did. Tyrion turned to her, eyes wide. "It's over, they're yielding." Drogon hovered. Daenerys didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the Red Keep, that towering reminder of everything her family had built and lost. Her father had died in those halls. Her brother had wept beneath those stones. Her bloodline had been wiped clean from that throne, and now it stood before her, undefended. The dragon beneath her stirred. His breath came hot, his body tensed. "Then," she whispered, "Dracarys." The sky ignited, Drogon roared, and fire poured. From his throat, not toward the soldiers, not toward the walls, but toward the city itself. Streets burst into flame, cobblestones cracked. The outer district, already decaying, was engulfed in an instant. Screams rose, people ran, the bells kept
ringing, but she didn't stop. Viserion followed, his fire slashing through the harbour.
Rhaegal dove toward the gate, his flames chasing crowds as they scattered like ants. Tyrion screamed, helpless, as he watched it all burn. "No!" He stumbled, fell to his knees, his voice breaking. She promised, but she hadn't. Daenerys had crossed a line she could never return from, and Westeros would never forget it. Inside the Red Keep, the temperature rose with each passing moment. Qyburn stood at the vault entrance, a cloth covering his face, his eyes watering. "The toxin will not discriminate," he said. Tywin stood still, unmoving. "She is burning everything," Kevin muttered, horrified. "Even the innocent."
"Made her choice," Tywin replied. "Now I make mine." He gave the nod. Qyburn stepped into the shadows. A moment later, a soft hiss filled the air. Nothing dramatic. No explosion, no flame, just silence. The kind that spread, the kind that killed. Above, Daenerys was circling again, Drogon's breath glowing hot, readying another pass, but suddenly he jerked, mid-flight. A low, ragged growl tore from his throat. His wings faltered.
Smoke, not from his fire but from his nostrils, began pouring in strange, twisting patterns. Daenerys clutched his back. "Drogon!" he roared, but the sound was wrong, choked, panicked. Then Rhaegal fell from the sky. No fire, no scream, just a long, spiraling drop that ended in a crash somewhere near Flea Bottom. Viserion tried to follow, but he, too, began to tremble mid-air, his eyes losing focus, wings flapping erratically. And Drogon began to descend, not by choice, but by gravity. They were being poisoned. From his tower window, Tywin watched without expression. The dragons dropped, one by one, like dying stars. The city burned around him, but he didn't flinch. Kevanny turned to him, voice trembling. "You'll die too." "I know," Tywin said simply. He didn't look like a man scared of death. He looked like a man satisfied by legacy. If this is what it takes to end her reign before it begins, then so be it. He turned from the window, calm and unshaken, and walked into the firelight. Drogon crashed into the outer plaza near the Sept ruins, his body heaving, wings crumpled. Daenerys tried to rise, coughing, stumbling through ash and blood and smoke. Her army, what was left of it, rushed to her side, but the dragons, all three, were down. The Breathless had done what no army, no arrow, no man ever could. It had killed the myth. The sky was quiet now. The fire still burned. But the fire-breathers were silent. And in that moment, Daenerys Targaryen, breaker of chains, mother of dragons, became just a girl, lost in a war she no longer controlled. Ash fell like snow. It drifted across the silent streets of King's Landing, coating the rubble, the corpses, the ruined spires. The bells had stopped. The dragons no longer cried. The city, once bloated with chaos and colour, was now a monochrome graveyard. Daenerys sat in the ruins of the plaza where Drogon had crashed. His massive form rose and fell with shallow breaths, his eyes glazed and weak. Rhaegal was dead. Viserion, barely alive, had crawled into the shade of a shattered tower and had not moved since. The Unsullied guarded her in a tight circle, wary of poison in the wind. The Dothraki had scattered, some in retreat, some in madness. The army she'd built across 2 continents was now a bleeding, gasping thing. She did not speak. She did not cry. Her eyes were hollow, staring at the red keep in the distance. The place she had sworn to reclaim. She had reached the gates and then watched it all slip through her fingers. Tyrion approached cautiously. His face was grey with ash and grief. He had watched children burn. He had heard the crackle of bone, the collapse of dreams. He had seen the woman he believed in become something no one could defend. He stood before her, but she didn't look at him. "You said you'd break the wheel," he said softly. "But all I see is a new one, hungrier, sharper." Still she didn't speak. He lowered his voice. "You can't fix this with fear."
"Not anymore. You need to stop." Slowly she turned to him. Her voice came hoarse. "I already have." And in that moment, he saw it. Behind the soot, behind the blood. Not madness, emptiness. She was done fighting, but Westeros was not done.
With her. Far from the plaza, inside the red keep's blackened bones, a maester carefully approached what was once the council chamber. The toxin had faded. The air was no longer deadly. The breathless had done its work swiftly. Everyone inside had died painlessly, if not peacefully. Tywin's body was found seated in his old chair, his hands folded neatly on the table. As if he had simply fallen asleep mid-meeting, a parchment sat before him, unsealed. She will come. She will burn. Let the world see both of us for what we are. Tywin of House Lannister, the last Lion of Casterly Rock, had not died a coward. He had made the final move, and the realm had watched. In the days that followed, the silence spread. Ravens flew north, east, and west. Some carried reports of Daenerys's victory, others the horrifying price. Every lord read the same line. The dragons are dead. The queen still lives. And each house faced the same question. Would they kneel to a queen who had no fire left, but a legacy of flame behind her? Sansa Stark sent no reply. Robin Arryn vanished behind the walls of the Eyrie. Dawn declared neutrality, as it always had. The Reach, shattered and leaderless, waited, and in the shadow of it all, Gendry Baratheon, legitimized by royal decree, marched, with Stormland soldiers toward the capital, not as an enemy, but not as a vassal either. The throne was empty, and everyone could feel it. Tyrion stood before the scorched iron throne, what remained of it. The blades had melted in the blaze. It no longer gleamed. It looked like a carcass, mangled, blackened, cursed. He turned as Daenerys entered, walking alone. No guards, no dragons, just her. "I should have burned it," she said quietly. Tyrion shook his head. "It burned itself." She looked at him then, eyes softer than they had been in weeks. "What happens now?" Tyrion let the silence settle. "They'll come. The lords. The banners. Not to swear loyalty, but to ask what you intend."
I have no more fire. Then speak with truth. He stepped closer. Show them Daenerys, not the queen, not the conqueror, just you. The council was called 1 week later. The great lords gathered among the ruins of the dragon pit.
No banners, no pageantry, just voices, nervous, angry, uncertain. Jon Snow arrived, having marched south in silence. Sansa came with her bannermen, but said little. Gendry, sunburned and tired, watched Daenerys with wary eyes. She stood before them with no crown, no armor, and no dragon at her side. "I cannot undo what I've done," she said. "But I will not pretend it was right. I fought for freedom. I fought to end the old world. And in the end, I became a part of it." Murmurs rose. Some called for trial, some called for exile, but none called for death. And that, Tyrion later said, was her true victory. In the end, Westeros chose peace, not unity. The 7 kingdoms became 6. The north remained independent under Queen Sansa. Gendry ruled the Stormlands. The Vale and Dawn held their own councils, and the throne, it was not rebuilt. A council of lords, rotating and bound by oath, would rule the capital. Tyrion took no seat. He remained a quiet advisor. Jon Snow returned to the Wall, not as punishment, but as refuge. And Daenerys? She left. With Drogon, barely breathing but still alive, she crossed the narrow sea once more. Not to conquer, not to build, but to disappear, to let the fire cool. Years later, children would ask who won the war between the lion and the dragon. Some said neither, some said both, but the truth was simpler. No one wins a war like that, they only survive it.